Good afternoon. Welcome. We tried our best today to replicate Irish weather for you. We had rain and snow, and now we have sunshine. It reminds me of being in Ireland. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum, Harvard's premier venue for the discussion of public policy and politics. Here, we try to establish a marketplace of ideas by inviting a wide range of opinions from our guests and by inviting questions from the floor. In keeping with that tradition, we will follow today our customary format. We will invite our speaker to offer remarks for 20 minutes or so, and then we will turn to you for questions. I will return to the podium at that point to moderate the question period. And I will ask those of you who will have questions to make your questions brief and preface them, if you will, by introducing yourself by name and your affiliation to the university, if any. Thank you. Before proceeding to my introduction of Mr. McGinnis, I would like to honor the request of another Irishman, Bob Manson, a second-year student here in the Master of Public Administration program, and invite you to join him and me in a moment of silence in respect for the hundreds of innocent people killed and wounded in yesterday's terrible bombings in Madrid. A moment of silence, please. Thank you. Over 40 years ago, President Kennedy said of Ireland, "You have undergone a new and peaceful revolution, transforming the face of this land while still holding to the old spiritual and cultural values. You have modernized your economy, harnessed your rivers, diversified your industry, liberalized your trade, accelerated your rate of growth, and improved the living standards of your people." He continued, "No larger nation did more to keep Christianity and Western culture alive in their darkest centuries, and no larger nation has ever provided the world with more literary and artistic genius." He concluded by saying, "My friends, Ireland's hour has come. You have something to give the world, and that is a future of peace and freedom." When President Kennedy said those words, he could not have foreseen the troubles that were to come in Northern Ireland. But at this point in history, we hope and trust that his words will prove prophetic for all of Ireland. Martin McGuinness's own life reflects the modern history of Northern Ireland in all its conflict, struggles, and possibilities for peace. Mr. McGuinness was born in 1950, became involved in the civil rights movement in Derry in October 1968, and joined Sinn Féin in 1970. In 1972, he was a member of the team that engaged in talks with then British Secretary of State William Whitehall. In the 1980s, he moved to become one of the architects of Sinn Féin's entry into the political process that eventually led to the peace accords. In 1990s, he participated in secret exchanges of information with representatives of the British government. In May of 1996, he was elected Sinn Féin negotiator in the Forum elections. In 1997, he was elected MP for the Mid-Ulster constituency and re-elected in 2001. In 1999, he became Minister of Education in the new Assembly and before the suspension of government, he earned very good reviews for his work in reforming education in Northern Ireland. He is returning to this podium for the second time. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Minister Martin McGuinness.
Well, can I first of all begin by thanking Dean McCarthy and Bill White, the Forum Director, for the invitation to come, and to thank each and every one of you for turning up today. A funny thing really did happen to me on the way to the Forum today. I said that to Bill White on the way in, and he didn't take me seriously at all. But then he did, when I told him what happened. What happened was Aidan McAteer and myself, Aidan's here with me from Ireland, we decided to take a walk. I usually like to take a walk before events like this, just to get a breath of air and clear the head. But as always, we were walking in downtown Boston and spotted a bookstore, decided we would go into the bookstore. Borders, I think they call it. Most inappropriate from our point of view. But it was directly outside the Irish Famine Memorial. And who did we happen to find ourselves in the bookstore with but Senator John Kerry? So amazingly, we met one of his aides who had been to Parliament buildings in Belfast with Bill Clinton on an occasion when he was there. He immediately went over to Senator Kerry, told him that we were there, and he came straight over and stood for 5, 6, 7 minutes asking about the situation in Ireland. So a funny thing really did happen on the way to the Forum today. Anyway, he asked about the situation in Ireland, and I don't have any doubt when we get to questions, many people here will have many questions, and usually events such as this are much more interesting when you get to that stage. But as I briefly told him, my view of the present situation, I'd also like to, over the course of the next 15 or 20 minutes, spend some time talking about the situation in Ireland at the moment in relation to the peace process. The theme of our discussions today is around, will Britain ever keep faith? And the short answer to that is that I hope so. The long answer to that is that whenever Tony Blair came to the position of British Prime Minister with the Labour Party in 1997, in my opinion, he was a breath of fresh air. He certainly intended to do things differently. And negotiations which Gerry Adams and I had on quite a number of occasions predicted would happen actually came to fruition against all the odds. And of course, it was our view that if we achieved a situation where all of the participants were at the negotiating table, dealing seriously with all of the issues that lie at the heart of the conflict, then there was a possibility, and at that stage it was no stronger than a possibility, that we could actually get an agreement. And so we got the agreement on Good Friday 1998. I think the principal factor in all of that was the fact that Tony Blair and the Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, actually came to Castle Buildings as the negotiations were effectively approaching the close. And they effectively told David Trimble, as leader of the Ulster Unionist Party and the Ulster Unionist delegation, that they had to go with this agreement. And they did, and we did. And I think in doing so, we have brought about effectively a transformation of the political situation in the north of Ireland. There is still more transforming to do. There are difficulties, there are problems, there are obstacles. But I think that we are, if there's a will, well capable of dealing with many of these obstacles. So I pay tribute to Tony Blair as the British Prime Minister, and of course to the Taoiseach, for the work that they did which led to that agreement. I think that Tony Blair is, and I still believe it, the first British Prime Minister, maybe in our history, to seriously deal with Britain's relationship with the island of Ireland in a very serious way. And of course the level of support that we achieved from here in the United States of America was absolutely incredible. Irish America rallied to the cause of justice and peace. the White House took an interest. Bill Clinton was in the White House. And Bill Clinton made a remarkable, very powerful, very positive contribution to our peace process. And of course, there's now a new administration under President Bush, and they have retained their interest in the peace process and have consistently said, and I applaud them for it, that the Good Friday Agreement needs to be fully and faithfully implemented. Richard Haas from the State Department was his point man, and he too made a very powerful contribution, someone who I think was very genuinely, emotionally and intellectually engaged in the need to ensure that our peace process was a success. And now he has been replaced by Mitchell Reese, who I will meet with next Tuesday in Washington, and then go on to meet with the President at the White House next Wednesday on the day of our patron saint, St. Patrick. So I think when you talk about the situation in Ireland, you have to see everything in the context of the remarkable transformation that has occurred. When you look around at the world today and the conflict that exists in Afghanistan and Iraq, the disgraceful bombs yesterday in Madrid, the situation in the Middle East, you can clearly see that what Bill Clinton talks about consistently when he goes abroad, of the need to hold up the Irish peace process as a model of how conflict can be resolved, how badly needed that is. Now, we don't have an inflated sense of our importance in the world. We know that we're only a small island with some 5 million people. But we do think the most important thing facing us and before us is the whole issue of successfully concluding a peace process that means so much, not just to people in Ireland, not just to the Catholics and the Protestants, the Unionists, the Loyalists, the Nationalists and the Republicans, but to people internationally who are looking on at the terrible state that the world finds itself at this time, and they are looking for beacons of hope, bright lights that they can point to. And we are hoping to provide that on the island of Ireland by facing up to the work that needs to be done in order to bring this to a successful conclusion. I'm not going to go over the history of the last 10 years. I think everybody's very conscious of what happened from, if you like, the beginning of the IRA cessations in 1994, which will be 10 years old now this year. That situation did kickstart a whole new way of moving forward. And as a result of that, many hundreds, maybe even thousands of people who would have died are alive and walking the streets of Belfast and Derry and many other parts of the 6 counties. And so we have to always see it in that context, that whatever problems and difficulties exist at the moment, these must always be seen as problems and difficulties to be overcome, and not obstacles that we can't surmount. And I certainly view my role as being one of the representatives who would be the optimistic wing, if you like, of the peace process, who believes that the peace process is really the only way forward, and that the full and faithful implementation of the Good Friday Agreement is undoubtedly the way to go. I found myself as Minister of Education in a very powerful position in terms of the new power-sharing government, and it's most appropriate coming here today to this area of education in Boston, that I remind people that in the first speech that I ever made, and in the first sentence of the first speech that I ever made, Abraham Lincoln once said that education was the most important issue facing the people of the United States. And I certainly believe that that is true. That is why I chose education. I believe it would put me and Sinn Féin at the heart of government, but more importantly, would allow me to deal with the essential change that had to take place in our education system. I believe that there was a cry for change from the people, from the Protestants, the Catholics, the dissenters, and those who didn't believe in anything. And there were many major issues that I majored on. One was the state of the schools estate and the need to improve the schools, many of them which went back to the famine days in Ireland, totally inappropriate for learning, particularly at primary school level, and made the biggest investment in finance of any education minister since the foundation of the state. It's also important to point out that in 30 years, I was the first Minister of Education who actually came from the north of Ireland. All of the rest came from England, from Wales, and from Scotland. And so I set about trying to transform the situation, improving the school's estate, but also improving the situation for disabled children, setting up joint task force with the Irish government to deal with things like dyslexia and autism, and also providing proper learning environments for children with severe, moderate learning difficulties. But the biggest issue of all was the issue of what is called the 11 plus. The British brought to us an examination some 50 years ago called the 11 plus. They got rid of it about 25 years ago, but up until the present day we have it. I took a decision to abolish it, and I think I was right to do so, and I think that clearly there is overwhelming support in the community for my decision. When I became Minister of Education, some people said to me, "Don't even think about doing anything about the 11 plus." I should explain, the 11 plus is an exam where children are tested at the age of 10 and a half or 11. And dependent on how they do in the exam, 1/3 of the cohort which sits the exam goes forward to a grammar school education, and the other 2/3 effectively get letters telling them that they're failures, and they go forward to a secondary education. I never believed that any education system or any society had the right to tell any child at the age of 10 and a half or 11 that it was a failure. And so we set about the process of changing that, but it was said to me, don't even think about doing anything about this, because the powers that be will come down on top of you like a ton of bricks. And I said, well, oh yeah, who are the powers that be? And they said, well, the powers that be are the Catholic bishops and the Protestant churches. But by the time I had left the Department of Education, the best friends I had in the education debate were the Catholic bishops and the Protestant churches. To such a point, whenever the chairman of the Education Committee at the Assembly, who is an Ulster Unionist, and the Unionists are more in favour of the 11 plus than the politicians on the nationalist side, he got up and gave a speech at the Church of Ireland Synod, which was very critical of my attempts to abolish the 11 plus, and was effectively booed off the stage by Protestant ministers who were not prepared to accept the arguments that he was making. Whenever the institutions were suspended, the Unionist parties wrote to the British Prime Minister and asked him to reverse my decision, and he wrote back to say that he wasn't prepared to do that. And we're now heading on for new arrangements which will transform our education system at post-primary level. Now, I go into those few minutes of discussion about education because I have to say I bitterly resent the fact that I'm not still doing my job and carrying on with the essential programme of change. And the reason I'm not doing my job is because the British government took a decision which is in breach of the Good Friday Agreement for all of Tony Blair's good points. They have breached the agreement by suspending the institutions that the people voted for. And I think that that was a big mistake. Now, we have to examine the reasons why that is the case. I would contend that that is the case simply because we've had a situation from Good Friday right through to the present day where unionist political leaders find it very difficult to come to terms with the type of change that the Good Friday Agreement heralded for all of us. And why is that the case? Well, the Democratic Unionist Party, led by the Reverend Ian Paisley, have been very honest and forthright about where they stand. They didn't like the agreement. They wanted the destruction of the agreement, and they said for the last 4 or 5 years that that was their primary objective in life. So why do they not like the agreement? Well, some would contend within the Nationalist Republican constituency they don't like it because they don't like sharing power with Catholics, or with Fenians, as we're called by some people back home. That they don't like to see Catholics about the place. They certainly don't like the All-Ireland institutions, the North-South Ministerial Council, established under the terms of the agreement, where we have a responsibility to deal with different aspects of life in a way which will be to the benefit of all of the people. For example, through the establishment of bodies like Tourism Ireland, where Ireland is marketed on the international stage as a single entity. We also have a trading body in Ireland, Intertrade Ireland, which trades basically on an all-Ireland basis. And of course, increasingly, business people and economists are recognising that the partition of Ireland, at least in an economic sense, is a total and absolute nonsense, because we regularly see business people from Dublin now in Belfast, and the same with Belfast business people regularly in Dublin. So, effectively, that's why the DUP are opposed to the Good Friday Agreement. Our big difficulty with the process is that we were dealing with an Ulster Unionist Party, who we actually found ourselves in government with, who publicly were saying they were in favour of the agreement, but privately were telling senior people in both governments, the Irish government and the British government, that they really didn't like the Good Friday Agreement because the Good Friday Agreement wasn't a good deal. And whenever essential legislation which flowed from the Good Friday Agreement actually went before the British House of Commons, right, left and centre, they voted against it. They didn't like the Human Rights Commission, they didn't like the Equality Commission, and they tried to, and successfully got Peter Mandelson to change important legislation into what should have brought the new beginning for policing for all of us, and which was disastrous in terms of the handling of the whole issue of policing. The issue of demilitarisation was another issue that they opposed. They also opposed General de Chasselin's decommissioning body. They were not prepared to accept his word as an independent arbiter of how weapons would be put beyond use. And I would contend that that is the reason why the institutions are suspended, because of the ongoing difficulties of unionists. They put up a different argument. They talk about what they talk in terms of ongoing paramilitarism, by which they means they are still pointing the finger at the IRA. At a time whenever the vast bulk of violence that occurs in the north of Ireland is actually coming out of the unionist community, with the activities of unionist paramilitaries who, for example, it has been announced in the last couple of days, were responsible for the killing of 7 people over the course of the last year, and responsible for something like 180 bomb explosions at Catholic premises and houses in the north. Unionists are very muted about all of that, but they're very vocal about what turned out in many occasions to be unsubstantiated allegations against the IRA. So, fast forward all of this to the events of October 2002 and the suspension of the institutions. The pretext for that was that unionists were alleging, and elements within the British securocratic system actually agreed with them, that there was, to quote, a Sinn Féin spy ring at Parliament buildings in Belfast. Full glare of publicity, TV cameras, the police force, PSNI move in and remove one little disc from a Sinn Féin office. Throughout the building there are dozens and dozens of Sinn Féin offices, but within the one office, lifted one disc and effectively come out and charged 2 people with being involved in a spy ring. Within the last 3 months, all the charges against those people in relation to that charge have been dropped by the Director of Public Prosecutions. But still the institutions remain suspended. The Sinn Féin leadership has consistently tried with unionist leaders and the 2 governments to bring about the restoration of the institutions and the ongoing process of ensuring the implementation of the agreement. We brought it to such a point last October of last year, the 21st, when after months of detailed negotiations with the 2 governments and direct contact between myself and Gerry Adams and David Trimble and his negotiating team, we actually concluded an agreement with them on the evening of October the 19th in a sitting room at Hillsborough Castle, the home of the British Direct Rule Minister Paul Murphy. And what was the agreement? The agreement was that the British government would call the election for the Assembly. The election should have been held anyway, it was cancelled and shouldn't have been. That Gerry Adams would make a speech, which David Trimble had in his hand and said it met with his approval. That the IRA would make a statement referring to Gerry Adams' speech, which David Trimble also had sight of and approved of. And that the IRA would put, yet again, another substantial quantity of weapons beyond use, the biggest so far in the process. We had David Trimble's statement, in which he was to sign up to the stability of the institutions, the transfer of powers on policing, on criminal justice within 2 years. We also had statements from the British government, from the British Prime Minister and from the Taoiseach, in which they would fulfil commitments that they had not delivered on and which saw life in the joint declaration, which was negotiated between us and them earlier in the year. So Gerry Adams steps up to the plate, makes a speech, By the way, I should say David Trimble on that evening actually gave us his solemn word of honour when I asked him, would he go with his statement if Gerry Adams did what he said he would do and if the IRA did what they said they would do, and he said he would. So Gerry Adams, early in the morning, made a speech, the IRA issued their statement, the IRA put weapons beyond use, General Chesson verified it, and David Trimble refused to make his statement. Now, I can actually handle the fact that David Trimble refused to make a statement. Don't like it, think he was wrong, broke his word. What I can't handle is the fact that the two governments have not fulfilled the commitments that they have made across a whole wide range of issues. So we actually ended up then fighting an election in circumstances which we didn't want to fight the election. The most appropriate circumstances was to fight the election against the background of David Trimble wholeheartedly embracing this latest agreement, going out to fight for it, going out to bat for it, and I would contend that if he had done that, he might have got a different result in the election. Now the election has been held, the Democratic Unionist Party have been returned as the largest party on the Unionist side, and Sinn Féin has been returned as the largest political party on the Nationalist side. And I think in terms of our vote, it is hugely significant that Sinn Féin, in that election, which was just in November of last year, came within 15,000 votes of becoming the largest political party in the north of Ireland. And I am quite convinced that at some stage in the future, Sinn Féin will be the largest political party in the north of Ireland. So where do things reside at the moment? Well, they're obviously as a result of a number of events occurring in recent times. Important change taking place. How important it will be yet remains to be seen. But certainly the days of Ian Paisley's leadership of the Democratic Unionist Party appeared to be fairly rapidly coming to an end. And I have no doubt whatsoever that that will then bring forward new leaders of that party. Probably will be people like Peter Robinson and Nigel Dodds and Jeffrey Donaldson, who left Mr Trimble's party, plus a number of others. On the Ulster Unionist side, David Trimble continues to lead a divided party, divided over his leadership. His days as leader of the Ulster Unionist Party are also probably numbered. But what is absolutely critical and key now, as we face into the business of trying to put the process back together again, is the need for meaningful discussions and dialogue to face up to many of these problems and difficulties. The Democratic Unionist Party have a position that they will not talk face-to-face with Sinn Féin, even though they've been in councils with us right throughout the north of Ireland over the course of the last 15 years. Even though they were in their education committees with their representatives talking to me about different aspects of education, they've now adopted this policy of not speaking directly to Sinn Féin. So I presume as a result of their proposals, which they announced some time ago, proposals in which they conceded that if there was to be any accommodation in the way forward, that there would have to be an agreement between the Unionist community and the Nationalist community. Well, if they represent, as they do, the majority of opinion within Unionism, and we, as we do, represent the majority of opinion within Nationalism, then they are basically arguing that there needs to be an agreement between the DUP and Sinn Féin. They also set out 3 proposals for the future governance of the North, 2 of which I regard as camouflage. One is called the Corporate Assembly, and the other is called a voluntary coalition, and the third is called a mandatory coalition, which is the one that most neatly fits into the Good Friday Agreement. And in that, the third one, they actually concede that there might be a government in the future which would contain the DUP and Sinn Féin. So how do we make all this happen? There are indications coming from the 2 governments that the DUP might be willing to do a deal with Sinn Féin, that we go into a process of negotiation. We would prefer it face-to-face, directly over the table, or if needs be in some other fashion. There is undoubtedly an exploration taking place at the moment, and we are very determined to ensure that if there is a serious attempt to get a big deal situation, that we will play our part. What is absolutely critical in all of this is the need for unionists to recognise that the Good Friday Agreement is really the only sensible template for future movement. And of course the whole issue of policing is a major issue in all of this, and bears down, I think, in an incredible way on many of the concerns that they have around what they describe as ongoing paramilitarism. I too want to see an end to all of that, bearing in mind that the majority of that actually comes out of the unionist community. But we want to work with them to ensure that it does come to an end. And I do want to see the stable institutions that the Taoiseach and the British Prime Minister talk about effectively restored. But policing will increasingly be, in the course of that discussion and dialogue, an important issue. And in the past we have seen a situation where the two governments effectively have followed a line which has effectively told us that they believed that the RUC, as it was prior to the establishment of the PSNI, was an acceptable policing force. And I think it has to be remembered that during the worst years of collusion, torture and human rights abuses, these governments actually defended and praised the RUC, authorised cooperation with it, and urged nationalists to join it. So I am of a view that people have a right to a first-class policing service, but it does not exist at this time. We will continue to work towards an acceptable, accountable police service, and we will lobby while we're in the US for support for a policing policy that is in line with the Good Friday Agreement. We've raised a series of major problems in policing with the British and Irish governments in recent weeks, and these problems do need to be solved if Nationalists and Republicans are, as I would wish us to do, endorse policing arrangements. 6 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, we're still some distance from achieving a democratically accountable and representative civic policing service, which is free from partisan political control. And while we've made considerable progress in the negotiations in recent years, we've also seen a failure on the part of the British government to implement what has been agreed, and increased resistance to change from within the PSNI, particularly the special branch. Now, one thing is clear. We do not have a new beginning to policing, and the following are the main obstacles to that being achieved. Partisan political control of policing remains intact. Effectively, British Securocrats still retain ultimate control of policing and justice throughout the Northern Ireland office, the British Secretary of State, and PSNI Chief Constable Hugh Ord. So we do need to see the transfer of powers from British Securocrats on policing and justice to the Assembly, to the elected representatives of people in Ireland. This is an issue I raised with Tony Blair 3 years ago in Downing Street, and he conceded that that was his preferred option. The PSNI does remain an unrepresentative of the community it polices, and it is unacceptable to nationalists, and the last two elections have clearly shown that the electorate have supported our position as opposed to the SDLP's. We need to see the transfer of powers as quickly as possible because it is a key issue, and we have raised it in the context of ensuring that we can advocate to our young people that they're not joining a British policing service, that they're joining a policing service that is accountable to a Minister for Justice in the Northern Assembly. I think also people need to be aware that plastic bullets need to be withdrawn from use. They are lethal weapons which have been used indiscriminately and which have killed children. Repressive legislation continues to be used by the PSNI as it was by the RUC, and PSNI vehicles and stations have not been demilitarised. They still patrol from heavily armed military fortresses in nationalist areas. So effectively, many things are wrong with policing, and we believe that if that issue can be got right, and there's no reason why it can't, that we can move the situation forward. So that is the big challenge over the course of the next period, to ensure that we have an honest negotiation, that we ensure that there's a big effort made to try and tackle all of the issues. We have huge problems with the unionist attitude to the agreement. Unionists apparently have huge problems with the Republican input to the process. Well, then I say, well, let's discuss that. We've made huge progress thus far. Let's sit down, man to man, woman to woman, and deal with all of these issues in a comprehensive way. And I think that we can. There's no doubt whatsoever that we can move the situation forward quite decisively. So thanks for listening. We obviously we're going to a short question and answer session now, and maybe that might allow people to ask questions that they think I haven't dealt with in the course of my contribution. Gurabeel Margaret.
Thank you very much. Mr. McGuinness has to leave at about 5 o'clock, so let's keep the questions as brief as possible so that he has a chance to answer as many as he can. In the time remaining, the people who are used to this are already lining up at the mics. There are mics up above as well. If you'd like to move to the microphone, please remember to identify yourself and your affiliation with Harvard, if any. And we'll go clockwise, starting with Kevin Corky here.
My name is Kevin Cork. I'm a mid-career graduating in June. I'm wondering if you would be so kind as to describe your feelings for George Mitchell throughout the peace process, and whether or not it's your opinion that maybe it's time that he made a return visit.
Well, George Mitchell famously said to Gerry Adams and I on one occasion, "Listen, guys, you have a life and this is it. I have a life and this is not it." George Mitchell is an incredible man and has also, in conjunction with President Clinton and President Bush and others, made a very powerful contribution to our peace process, and we will forever be indebted with him. Just to give you an idea of what George Mitchell has to put up with, after he left the first time, he went away and wrote a book, and we brought him back again at a time of crisis. And in his book, he was critical of the Democratic Unionist Party and the Reverend Ian Paisley. So the first delegation that he had to meet was the DUP. So they arrived in, all their leading players were there, Peter Robinson, the Reverend William McRae, Reverend Ian Paisley's son, Nigel Dodds. And Ian Paisley Jr. has a copy of the book with him. And they go on and they're allocated an hour to talk about the Good Friday Agreement and how to restore the process, blah, blah, blah. But for the full hour, they lambasted him, gave him a very hard time. Eventually left the room. George says he sat down, breathed a sigh of relief, and about a minute later the knock came to the door, and it was Ian Paisley's son, Ian Paisley Jr.
Yeah.
And he said, "Senator, you wouldn't do me the honour of signing this book." So do you think he's going to take more of that punishment?
Yeah, I don't think so. Thank you.
My name is Michael Linus. I'm a Kennedy School student. Mr. McGuinness, in the Good Friday Agreement, you made a solemn promise to the people of Ireland, myself included, that you would pursue exclusively democratic and peaceful means. But since then, you failed to keep that promise. We've had aspiring, bringing down the institutions. We've had punishment beatings almost daily of mainly Catholic youths in Belfast, including a murder attempt that was stopped by the police a couple of weeks ago. And we've had members of your party involved in training Marxist guerrillas in Colombia. Isn't the Irish Justice Minister correct when he accuses your party of vomit-making hypocrisy? And isn't the real question you should be answering today, will Martin ever keep faith?
Well, first of all, can I say that in Ireland people know that Michael McDowell, the Justice Minister, is virulently anti-nationalist and anti-Republican, and has been for some considerable time, very anti-Sinn Féin. They are facing into the upcoming local government and European elections. So it's the election stupid. That's why we're getting all of this talk from particularly Michael McDowell at this time. Why is that the case? Because Michael McDowell is concerned about the fact that Sinn Féin is the largest almost political party in the north, but the fastest growing political party on the island, and is concerned that at the next general election in the south that he might not actually be in the coalition government because they won't effectively have the numbers. All of the issues of which you speak distort the truth of the situation. My position, for example, on punishment beatings has been clear for 20 years. I remember making a Republican speech at an Easter Sunday commemoration in Belfast 20 years ago, in which I called for an end to all punishment beatings and all punishment shootings. And my position has been consistent ever since. Sinn Féin is totally and absolutely opposed to those. But we have a huge difficulty, and the difficulty centres on the fact that we do not have a proper, acceptable policing service that people can give their allegiance to. So we are dealing with all of those issues. The reason we didn't move forward on October the 21st last year wasn't because of all the points that you identified. Let's be clear about what happened. David Trimble was content with Gerry Adams's speech in which he pointed to a new peaceful direction for everyone to follow, including Republicans. He was happy with the IRA's response to that. The reason he wasn't prepared to go forward to restore the institutions was because he effectively couldn't get Steven Spielberg to show up at the decommissioning event. Now, that's the reason he wouldn't go forward in the government with Sinn Féin. Because I think David Trimble and senior people within his party knows that the Sinn Féin leadership are absolutely committed to pursuing exclusively peaceful and democratic methods of moving forward. And that will remain our consistent position. I think it's very wrong of you to, while we await the outcome of people who are on trial in Colombia, for example, to presume the guilt or innocence of anyone. In fact, all of the international observers that have been to that trial have effectively said that there's no case against the people and that they expect them to be released, as I expect them to be released in the course of the coming weeks and months.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Beck. I work for City Year, which is an AmeriCorps program that allows young people to serve their communities full-time and address critical social needs. One component of national service is to bring together people from all backgrounds, racial, religious, gender education level, and socioeconomic status, to work together and break down social barriers amongst each other. What are the possibilities of national service in Northern Ireland as a means to bring peace among people of different cultures?
Well, I mean, could I say the best approach for us is the approach that was adopted last year. Last year was the quietest summer in Belfast in 30 years. Why was that the reason? That was the reason because people from within my community, the nationalist, Irish nationalist community, got together with people from within the British Unionist tradition who live in interface areas to ensure that there was no conflict at those interface areas between people of different religions. Because there is, I think, an acceptance that all of this stuff that occurs is totally detrimental to the local communities, totally counterproductive to the interests of the working class people in the Protestant and Catholic communities in the north of Ireland. I think that the proposal that you are suggesting is certainly one that can be considered. But I think it has to be considered in an Irish context. I think that from our point of view, what is vitally important in an area where people vote in big numbers anyway, and our young people don't have any problem whatsoever in understanding the value of their vote and the power of their vote. I mean, my constituency at the last general election, which I fought, 85% of the constituency voted in the election. So clearly you can see that there is a real engagement taking place. More important for us in Sinn Féin is to stretch out the hand of friendship to people from the Unionist tradition. And we have actually got a pool of people within our party who regularly meet with the Protestant Civic Society, the Protestant churches, on an ongoing basis, because we know that there are many, many tens of thousands of good people in the Unionist community who are as passionate about seeing the peace process succeed as we are. And I think key to all of that is to try and get the message of the peace process across to young people within our society and every section of our community. How they contribute to that in terms of what organisation or what structure is something that needs to be teased out. At the minute, people are working through organisations and structures in their own areas. And if last year's evidence is anything to go by, and if we repeat that again this year, we can continue the charting the course away from conflict in Belfast, which is obviously a hot point area, particularly during the course of the marching season.
Krishna Guha, I'm also a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. I wanted to ask you about the issue of IRA arms. We're 6 years after the Good Friday Agreement, and the IRA still, by all accounts, holds the vast majority of its military arsenal intact. Now, I find it very difficult to envisage a situation where the IRA would ever actually wish to use those weapons again in the context that we face now. And yet, surely the existence of those arms spreads distrust among the unionist community. At the very least, what it must do is provide unionist politicians who don't want to engage with the agenda you're talking about with the perfect excuse not to do so. So I understand that that the IRA is not under any obligation as a matter of its agreements to have fully disarmed by now. But there's a question still of what it would choose to do. Why not fully disarm by now?
Well, I mean, if I could wiggle my nose and make all of that happen tomorrow morning, I would. But I live in the real world. I live in a world where unionist politicians for many decades, I mean, for example, I don't know if people here are aware of the fact that whenever a military organisation or a paramilitary organisation called Ulster Resistance was launched, it was launched in the Ulster Hall in Belfast by the Reverend Ian Paisley and Peter Robinson, the now leaders of the Democratic Unionist Party. Ulster Resistance imported tons of weapons into the country, mainly from an apartheid South Africa, through a British agent called Brian Nelson. And those weapons were distributed among the UDA, the UVF, and the other third was held by Ulster Resistance. I don't hear anybody asking whether or not the Reverend Ian Paisley has talked to General DeChaslin about how he gets Ulster Resistance or the UDA and the UVF to decommission their weapons, particularly as none of those organisations have decommissioned anything. None of them have put any weapons beyond use, and I never hear the Reverend Ian Paisley ever talking about those weapons. So, from our perspective in Sinn Féin, we have succeeded in convincing the IRA they should put weapons beyond use. I'm not sure how you can speak with authority on how many they've put beyond use or whether or not they've put the majority, because the only person that knows that is General DeChaslin. He was set up as an independent commissioner with others to deal with that issue. We were content to take his word for it. Others should have done the same. Now, that said, I think it is a key issue, the issue of how we take all guns out of Irish politics. And I think that from a Republican perspective, remarkable successes have occurred over the course of recent years, and you have accepted that in the course of your contribution. So there's still much work to be done, but we can only crack this nut if people approach it on the basis of honesty. You know, the unionist politicians talk about, they have this phrase, and you've probably heard it here, Sinn Féin, IRA. The IRA is the military wing of Sinn Féin. Whilst, and I would contest that, but the reality of the situation is that within my community, people believe that the British Army is a military wing of unionism, that the Royal Irish Regiment is a military wing of unionism, that the old RUC was a military wing of unionism, and the B Specials. So there's a lot of fears all around the community. What's the best way to deal with it? Well, it is my view that what we should do with unionist leaders and the two governments, and the two governments have a key responsibility, is that there needs to be an attempt made in the coming weeks and months to get a comprehensive resolution of all these problems. We're up for that. We're willing to have that type of debate with them, but it has to be on the basis of more honesty from unionists to politicians, and indeed from the British government.
But sorry, if I may, just when you say of comprehensive settlement, would that include potentially complete disarmament by all armed parties?
Well, I'm trying to bring that about. That's precisely what I mean. If the unionists are raising this as an issue, then let's talk about it. But I mean, I wrote to Brian Cowan, the Foreign Minister of the Irish Government, and to Paul Murphy a week ago. And I told them, if we're going to address paramilitarism, we're all for that, because we want to talk about what we consider to be the vast bulk of paramilitarism that is coming out of the unionist community. And I also said that I wanted to talk to Ian Paisley about Ulster Resistance and about the weapons that they brought into the country, to see if he will help in any decommissioning process by convincing these armed groups on the unionist side that they should speak to General DeChaslin and at least begin the process of put weapons beyond use.
Hi, thank you. My name is Corinne. I'm a first-year biological anthropology student doing my PhD, so I'm a bit far removed from the political arena. So forgive me if my question sounds a bit simple, but I have a hypothetical for you. Let's say something funny happened to you on the way out of the forum, and instead of finding yourself at Borders Books, instead you find yourself at the gates to heaven. And God's there, or Peter's there, or whoever's there. that's supposed to be there. He asks you, Martin, why do you think you deserve a place in heaven given that you have broken one of the most serious of the 10 commandments? How would you justify your actions, or have you already asked for forgiveness?
Well, let me answer it this way. I spoke to my wife on the telephone this morning, and she told me that last night 2 members of the police force, the PSNI, arrived at my front door. This is true. And they handed my 19-year-old son a note which said that they had got word from a charitable organisation that they had received a message that I was to be executed at 8 o'clock tonight in Belfast. It's lucky I'm in Boston. So that might not be too far-fetched. I think people like Gerry Adams and myself and others have taken huge risks for peace. Many in the Sinn Féin leadership have risked their very lives to make that happen. I don't know how people can make judgments about who's entitled to enter heaven or not. I would contend everybody's entitled to a place in heaven because everybody undergoes all sorts of journeys in their, from the day they're born until the day they die. I'm not sure. I mean, I come from the Catholic faith. I'm a practicing Catholic. I do go to Mass and I do go to Holy Communion on a regular basis. But I have a problem about people deciding who's guilty and who's innocent. At the end of the day, I think that the God that I believe in, and I'm one that is very open-minded about everybody's religion and doesn't have a problem with Protestants or Hindus or Buddhists or anything at all. But I have a very, very clear view that my God is a very charitable God that understands the difficulties that people go through in their lives. And I hope and indeed expect that his judgment of me will not be a harsh one.
Yep. Yes. Me? Yes. Do you think that Ireland will be reunited ever?
I am absolutely certain that
When?
I can't put a figure on it. Whenever we signed up to the Good Friday Agreement, we did so on the basis that we believed that that agreement would provide a pathway to United Ireland. I believe it can be accomplished through the further development of the All-Ireland institutions that we agreed onto the terms of the agreement. It actually makes sense in such a small island for us to pool our resources. And I would hope that over a period of years, the vast majority of people in Ireland, including a substantial section of unionists, would accept that it actually makes sense. Now, I am content to wait until we make that happen. But I am also arguing that it must happen now by exclusively peaceful and democratic methods. And that's what I'm about. I think the sooner people come to terms with what's in the Good Friday Agreement, the sooner we can move on. I'll tell you something else that I believe. Mm-hmm. I believe that there are some unionist politicians who work on the basis that if you actually give a Catholic or an Irish nationalist equality, that's the end of the union as they know it. And do you know something?
Yeah.
They're 100% right.
Mm-hmm. I see. Will they ever... Do you know if and when they'll have a referendum on it?
Yeah.
On the reunification of Ireland?
Well, I mean, that was an issue dealt with under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, where provision is made for a referendum to be called. And we are actually arguing in the course of the review of the Good Friday Agreement for the British government to conduct a referendum on the border as quickly as possible. The other big thing that happened during the Good Friday negotiations was that the British government actually gave up what was called the Government of Ireland Act, where they now effectively accept that if at some stage in the future people in the north of Ireland vote for an end to British rule, that they will immediately legislate for the reunification of Ireland. So I think that we are making tremendous strides forward, but there's still a considerable amount of work to be done. We would love it, for example, to happen by the year 2016, which is the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising in Dublin.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. This one on the floor and then this one on the floor. Try to make them brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGuinness. I'm a graduate student in international relations at Boston University. And a couple years ago, when I was living in Belfast for a short time, I heard a number of people would say that they couldn't believe that a terrorist was in charge of their children's education. Of course, at the same time, there was also a number of other people saying, or not saying that at all. My question is kind of basic, but basically, how do you think the use of language has affected the negotiations and the troubles? And specifically, I'm interested in how you would define two words, the first being terrorist and the second being citizen.
Well, I mean, I'm very conscious that we have all, most of us in this room have lived through an era when Nelson Mandela was described as a terrorist. So, I mean, one man's terrorist or one woman's terrorist is another man or woman's freedom fighter. I'm not sure that it's useful to get into that type of a debate. I mean, I have always considered myself as part of a national liberation struggle in Ireland. I also think that in terms of the world that we find ourselves in at the minute, that the debate around all of that is absolutely pertinent. There are many very difficult situations in the world, all of which require resolution. And the use of language in any given situation is always one that is highly sensitive, because obviously the strategy of the British government, for example, in dealing with people like myself down the years, was variously to demonise us, to describe us as terrorists, and to effectively make non-people of us. And I suppose it is a political education of a lifetime that someone like me then finds himself in the position as Minister of Education and trying to bring about important change, even for the children of some people who would describe me as a terrorist. For example, on the Shankill Road, which is one of the most unionist, Protestant, loyalist areas of the north of Ireland. Do you know how many children from that area, under the 11 plus, which I have abolished, went forward to a grammar school education? 1%. A damning indictment of our education system. And I met many people from within the unionist community during my time as Minister of Education who were actually happier that I was the Minister of Education than all the direct rule ministers who went before me, because all of them had run away from the issue. So obviously the use of language and dialogue between me and them brought them to a position of knowing that I was a force for good in terms of education. When I was also in that department, the Council for the Review of the Curriculum were also dealing with the whole issue of citizenship, because you've hit the nail on the head. That is a key issue. And during the course of that work, which will all manifest itself in the course of the coming weeks and years, I think you will see almost a revolution within our education system around the whole concept of citizenship and the importance of that to everybody within our society.
I'm sorry, but this will have to be the last question, please.
I'm a second-year MBA student from Harvard Business School, and I study negotiations as part of my course. As a former leading officer in a recognized terrorist organization, the IRA, who managed to negotiate with an established power, what advice would you give Al-Qaeda in terms of negotiating with the United States and ETA in terms of negotiating with Spain?
Well, I wouldn't accept your analysis that the IRA are or ever were a terrorist organisation. They were very much part of a national liberation struggle, and their calling of the cessation in 1994 has effectively liberated all of us to think about new imaginative ways forward. What advice would I give all our people? I would give Al-Qaeda the advice that they should stop, and they should stop immediately. I think they're a bunch of headbangers. I think that what they done in the World Trade Center was absolutely diabolical and disgraceful. And I think the sooner they stop, the better. What advice would I give ETA? I've already given advice to ETA. I've asked them to look at our peace process. I have given advice also to the Spanish government that they should try to accomplish something in that part of the world that the British managed to accomplish in our part of the world. Recognise that dialogue is the way forward. Sit down and negotiate. and treat people with respect. That's what I want to see. And, I go back to, I'll finish up on this point. President Clinton did say, every speech that he makes in every part of the world now, he consistently points to the situation in the north of Ireland and how he always wanted to see that peace process held up as a model of how other conflicts can be resolved. And I agree with him. I think, we're not full of our own importance. We haven't got an overinflated sense of who we are and what we are. We're a very small island. But I think we have a very important contribution to make. Just as we learned a lot from the negotiations in South Africa, I think others can learn a lot from us. The peace process for us is the only way forward. We've been through a very bitter conflict. A lot of people have lost their lives. There's a lot of hurt and a lot of bad feelings. By your accent, do you come from England?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Well, I travel regularly to your country, to London, and I'm met with nothing but respect everywhere I go. People stop me in the street in London and they come up and say, well done, keep the good work going. And that clearly shows that out there within our communities, whether it be in Britain or in Ireland, that the peace process in Ireland means an awful lot to people in Britain and Ireland, and I would contend here in the United States and in the international community. What we have to do is continue with that work. And if we can influence Al-Qaeda in getting them to stop, and if we can influence ETA, and I don't know who was responsible for what happened yesterday, it's a very confused situation. I don't care who was responsible for it. It was wrong, it was deplorable, and it shouldn't have happened, and I unreservedly condemn it.
Thank you for being so generous with your time and views this afternoon. Come back to this podium again, please. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good